What would you do if a billionaire jokingly said she'd marry you, and you didn't laugh? Ryan Carter didn't. While everyone else in that marble garage chuckled at the joke, Ryan was already crouching beside a Porsche that hadn't run in 2 years, and his hands had gone completely still because he'd seen this car before. Not in a magazine, not in a dream. He'd worked on it with his own hands thousands of miles away, years ago, and something inside that engine bay was very, very wrong. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me. This one goes deep. The alarm didn't wake Ryan Carter. He was already up. He'd been up since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, staring at a water bill he couldn't fully pay, and a permission slip for Emma's school field trip that needed $12 he didn't have loose. Not in cash anyway. He could move things around. He always moved things around. That was the unofficial job description of being a single father. Financial juggler, emotional shock absorber, the person who smiles when they don't feel like smiling because a 7-year-old is watching. Emma padded into the kitchen at 6:15 wearing mismatched socks, one purple with stars, one plain white, and her hair doing something catastrophic on the left side of her head. "You're up early," she said, like she was commenting on the weather. "Couldn't sleep." She climbed onto the chair across from him and pulled the cereal box toward herself without asking. She was 7. She didn't ask anymore. She just existed in the house the way rivers exist in landscapes, finding the path of least resistance, shaping things quietly over time. "Is it a money morning?" she asked. Ryan looked up. "What?" "You get a face," she said, pouring cereal. "When it's a money morning, your forehead does a thing." He laughed despite himself. He reached across and pressed a thumb against the crease between her eyebrows, mimicking the expression. She giggled, milk nearly coming out of her nose, and for exactly 45 seconds, everything was fine. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. He didn't recognize the number. The area code was local, but the prefix was one of those business exchanges, the kind that came from offices with receptionists. He almost didn't answer. He had a policy about unknown numbers before 7 a.m., but something, he couldn't explain it then and couldn't explain it later, made him pick up. "Is this Carter Automotive?" The voice was crisp, female, the kind of voice that was used to being heard on the first attempt. "It is," Ryan said, standing up and walking toward the window. "Shop doesn't open until 8. "I'm aware." "This isn't a normal inquiry?" A brief pause. "My name is Diane Cho. I'm the executive coordinator for Ms. Isabella Kensington. She has a vehicle that requires attention, and I was given your name by someone who believes you're the right person for the job." Ryan's first instinct, and he wasn't proud of it, was to ask who gave her his name, because whoever it was had clearly oversold him to a billionaire's assistant, and that was going to be an awkward conversation. "What kind of vehicle, sir?" he asked instead. "A 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS touring spec. It hasn't run in approximately 22 months. Ryan put his coffee mug down. "Is there something wrong with what I said?" Diane asked. "No," he said. "No, I'm just... Give me the address." He dropped Emma at school 40 minutes later. She had fixed her own hair by then, or attempted to, and the result was something between a bun and a small explosion. He'd told her it looked great. She'd rolled her eyes with the world weariness of someone who knew she was being handled but appreciated the effort anyway. The address Diane had given him put him on the other side of the city entirely. Through downtown, past the financial district, up into the hills where the houses stopped looking like houses and started looking like architecture magazine covers. Ryan drove his work truck, a 12-year-old Ford F-150 with a cracked passenger mirror and a toolbox rattling in the bed. He was aware of how it looked as he turned through a pair of iron gates that probably cost more than his shop. The estate was the kind of property that made you recalibrate what words like large meant. The driveway alone was a quarter-mile of immaculate pavement lined with sycamores that had been pruned into perfect shapes. The main house was pale stone and glass, 3 stories, with a wing that extended east and what looked like a separate structure, smaller, more utilitarian, where the driveway curved toward the back. That, he figured, was the garage. He pulled up and sat in the truck for a moment. He could already see people moving near the garage entrance. Multiple people. Men in business casual. A woman in a blazer holding a tablet. None of them were wearing work clothes. He got out, reached into the back for his diagnostic bag, and walked toward them. "Mr. Carter?" The woman with the tablet materialized in front of him. Mid-30s, efficient posture, the expression of someone who processed a lot of information simultaneously. "I'm Diane. We spoke this morning." "Yeah," he said. "Nice place." She glanced at his truck the way people sometimes do when they're trying not to glance at it. "Miss Kensington will be out shortly. In the meantime, the vehicle is inside. You're welcome to begin a preliminary assessment." "What happened to the last guys?" he asked. Diane's expression shifted slightly. "Specialists," she said. "Several of them over the past 2 years. None of them were able to identify the fault." "What did they say was wrong with it?" "Different things. Fuel delivery issue, according to one. Electrical fault, according to another. A third suggested the engine had been rebuilt incorrectly at some point and would need to be remachined." She paused. "Ms. Kensington has spent considerable time and money on those assessments." Ryan nodded slowly. "And nothing worked." "Correct." He walked through the garage entrance and stopped. The space was immaculate, climate-controlled, tiled floor, proper lighting, the kind of setup that a serious collector built around serious machines. There were 4 other cars in the garage: a silver Mercedes SL from the mid-'80s, a restored Jaguar E-Type in British racing green, something under a dust cover he couldn't identify by shape, and a new black Range Rover that looked out of place among the classics, the way a sneaker looks at a black-tie dinner. And in the center bay, under lighting that had been specifically arranged to flatter it, sat the Porsche. Ryan walked toward it slowly. It was white, the original Grand Prix white that the 1973 Carrera RS had come in, before someone had made the terrible decision decades later to start painting them every color imaginable. The ducktail spoiler in the back, the wider rear fenders, the small side stripes, black, running from door to quarter panel. The wheels were Fuchs, original from the look of them, though he'd need to confirm. He crouched at the front and looked at the hood seams first, even gaps. Factory correct. He walked around the rear and looked at the engine lid, then opened it. And that's when his hands went still. Oh, he wasn't sure how long he stood there. Long enough that he heard footsteps behind him and the change in ambient conversation that meant someone important had arrived. "You must be the mechanic." The voice was different from Diane's, lower, less managed. There was something in it that suggested the speaker was accustomed to rooms going quiet when they spoke, but also slightly tired of it. Ryan straightened up and turned around. Isabella Kensington was not what he'd expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. Something more armored, maybe? More polished. She was 30. He knew that from nothing more than Diane's vague mention of Ms. Kensington has been dealing with this for nearly 2 years. She was wearing dark trousers and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she was holding a phone in one hand and a small espresso cup in the other. And she was looking at him with the kind of direct attention that some people had and most people didn't. She wasn't beautiful the way photographs made wealthy people beautiful. She was sharper than that, more angular, the kind of face that looked like it had made a lot of decisions and not all of them easy ones. "Ryan Carter," he said, offering his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm, brief, business. "How bad is it?" she asked, nodding toward the Porsche. "I need more time," he said. "But I want to ask you something first." Her eyebrows moved slightly. People probably didn't often lead with that. "Where did you get this car?" There was a pause. Behind Isabella, Diane had materialized again, and a few feet behind her stood 2 men Ryan hadn't fully cataloged yet. Suits, slightly built, the kind of quiet presence that suggested either attorneys or security. "I purchased it at auction," Isabella said, "approximately 4 years ago. It was represented as a numbers-matching 1973 Carrera RS Touring. The documentation was—" She stopped. "Why? What auction house?" She named one. It was reputable, well known in the collector car world. "And since you've owned it, has anyone else had significant access to the vehicle, other than the specialists?" The room had gotten quieter. Ryan noticed it without fully registering why. Victor handles the logistics of the collection, Isabella said, and there was something almost imperceptible in the way she said the name. Not affection exactly, but the casual weight of someone who had been part of her life long enough that his name required no last name. Victor Langford, my business partner. He coordinated the purchases, the maintenance schedules. She paused. Why are you asking these questions? Ryan looked at the car, then back at her. Because I've worked on this car before. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that changes rooms. That's not possible, Diane said from somewhere behind Isabella. I'm not saying it's not unusual, Ryan said. He wasn't being confrontational. He was just being accurate. I'm saying I've worked on this car, or one that matches it very specifically. He looked at Isabella. Can I show you something? She set the espresso cup down on the hood of the Range Rover, not the Porsche, he noticed. She was careful about that, and walked forward. Ryan crouched and pointed to the area just below the engine case. There should be a small stamped mark here, not the main engine number, a secondary mark that was put there during a restoration. It's not factory. It was done by a restorer named Heinrich Brauer, who ran a shop outside Stuttgart. He marked every car that came through his facility. He looked up at her. It would be 2 letters and 3 numbers, his initials and a sequential job number. Isabella crouched beside him. She was close enough that he could smell something expensive and uncomplicated. Not perfume exactly, just clean. She looked at the spot he indicated. She reached out and touched the area, rubbed at it slightly with her thumb. HB041, she said. Ryan sat back on his heels. HB041, he repeated. 41st car through Brauer's facility. He had worked on 38 through 47 during his 8 months in Germany, right after his apprenticeship, right before he came back to the United States, right before his wife got sick, right before everything changed. He knew this car. He had spent 11 days with it. He remembered the way the left rear suspension had been slightly off geometry, and how Brauer had made him measure it 17 times before declaring it correct. He remembered the creak in the passenger seat that they never fully resolved. He remembered the smell of the interior, a specific combination of old leather and something floral that one of the previous owners had clearly used as a cleaner and which had soaked into the carpet permanently. Heinrich Brauer died 4 years ago, Ryan said. Lung cancer. His facility closed. All of his records. He stopped. What? His records were supposedly destroyed in a fire at the shop about 18 months ago. Isabella stood up. She was looking at him differently now. You worked for him, she said. It wasn't a question. For 8 months. I was 24. It was supposed to be a 6-month rotation, but he asked me to stay on. Ryan stood up too. He was the best restorer in Europe at that time, possibly the best in the world. I learned more in those 8 months than I'd learned in the 4 years before. And you're sure this is the same car? I'm not sure of anything yet, he said honestly. I need a full inspection. I need to pull the interior and get to the chassis plates. I need to look at every number on this vehicle against what it should be. He paused. But the mark is there. And the engine, what I can see from the outside, there are components in here that aren't factory, which could be legitimate replacement parts or what? He chose his words carefully. Or someone made deliberate changes. Isabella's expression didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. A very subtle recalibration, the look of someone who had just been handed a piece of information that they needed to hold carefully while they decided what to do with it. How long do you need? She asked. Give me today, Ryan said, and let me work alone. She looked at him, direct, unblinking. All right, she said. He worked for 7 hours. Diane brought him a sandwich around noon that he ate with one hand while using the other to photograph the underside of the chassis. He was thorough in the way that Brauer had taught him, not just methodical, but narrative in his approach. Look at the car like it's trying to tell you something, Brauer used to say. Listen to what it says and what it doesn't say. The silence is louder than the noise. What this car was saying once he started listening was complicated. The engine was not the original. That alone wasn't remarkable. 40-year-old engines got rebuilt, replaced, swapped. It happened all the time. But the replacement engine was a later unit, a 2.7-liter from a standard 911, and it had been made to look like an original 2.7 RS unit. The fins on the fan shroud had been machined to match. Certain external components had been switched. Someone had put real effort into making a less valuable engine appear to be what it wasn't. The transmission casing had a similar story, a later unit dressed up to period-correct spec, but the chassis, the body, the interior bones, those were original. And not just original, they were exceptional. He pulled the carpet in the rear footwell and found what he'd been half hoping to find and half dreading, a small strip of paper wrapped in clear preservation film tucked into the channel where the carpet met the firewall. Brower's provenance notes. Every major restoration at HB Classic came with a hidden document, just a small card, really, with the car's complete history as Brower had been able to establish it, and his assessment of its condition and significance at the time of restoration. Ryan unfolded it carefully. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the shop floor, leaned his back against the Porsche's rear tire, and stared at the ceiling for a while. He found Isabella in a room off the main hallway, somewhere between an office and a library, walls of books on 2 sides, a desk in the center that was covered in organized chaos. She was on a phone call, but she saw him in the doorway and held up one finger. He waited. She wrapped the call up in about 90 seconds with the efficiency of someone who had learned that phone calls, left to their own devices, would expand to fill whatever time you allowed them. "Well?" she said. "The car is genuine," Ryan said. "The chassis, the body, everything structural. This is the real thing. But the engine isn't original." "No, and the transmission, and 2 other components that affect how the car is documented and assessed." He paused. "Someone replaced them with later, less valuable parts. And they did it carefully. Not so carefully that it wouldn't have been caught by a proper inspection, but carefully enough that someone who wasn't looking for it, or someone who had reason not to look too hard, might miss it." Isabella was very still. "How does that affect the car's value?" she asked. Her voice was even, controlled. Ryan had thought about how to say this on the walk from the garage to the house. He hadn't found a gentle version. With original matching components, a properly documented 1973 Carrera RS in this condition, with Brower's provenance notes, which I found hidden in the car, is worth somewhere between $2 and $2.4 million. He watched her face. "The car as it's currently documented, with the swapped components, is worth maybe $400,000. The number landed in the room and sat there. "Someone made this car worth $2 million less on paper than it actually is," Isabella said. "Yes. And then it stopped working." "The reason it stopped working," Ryan said, "is that the replacement engine is a known fault unit. The series it came from had a specific oil feed problem that causes progressive failure. Whoever put it in here either didn't know that, which is hard to believe if they were skilled enough to do the other work, or they expected it to fail." "They wanted it to fail," Isabella said quietly. It wasn't a question. "A car that doesn't run doesn't get driven to shows, doesn't get entered in competitions, doesn't get independently appraised as part of an active collection review." Ryan paused. "It just sits." He watched her work through it. She was fast. He'd already noticed that. She processed information the way good mechanics processed cars, looking at the whole system, the relationships between parts, not just the individual components. "If the car sits, the documentation stays as it is," she said. "No one looks at it too closely. No one discovers the components are wrong." She looked up at him. Someone wanted this car to be worth less than it is, and they wanted that to be permanent. "That's what it looks like." "And who had access to this car?" Ryan didn't answer that. It wasn't his place. But he held her gaze long enough that she understood he understood exactly what question she was really asking. "Victor?" she said, almost to herself. The name sat in the room between them. Ryan had learned over the years that there were moments in conversations where the wrong word could collapse something irreparably, and the right word could open a door that needed to be opened. He had also learned that sometimes the best thing you could do was say nothing and let the other person find their way to the truth themselves. People trusted conclusions they reached on their own more than conclusions that were handed to them. So he waited. Victor manages my entire collection, Isabella said, and her voice was doing something careful, like someone walking on ice they didn't trust yet. He's the one who found this car. He's the one who coordinated with the specialists. She stopped. He told me the last specialist thought it needed an engine rebuild. A major one. Expensive. Did you speak to the specialist directly? A pause. Victor handled the communication. Ryan picked his next words with surgical precision. I'm not in any position to tell you what this means, he said. I'm a mechanic. What I can tell you is what I found in the car. The rest of it, he paused. You should talk to someone you trust, someone qualified. Not me. Why not you? Because I just walked in here this morning and I'm covered in grease and I don't know what your arrangement with this man is or what this fits into. I could be wrong about the intent. I can't be wrong about the parts. They're physically in the car and I can show them to you. But intent is someone else's job. She was looking at him with that direct attention again, measuring something. You could have just fixed the car, she said. I could have. And not said anything. Yes. Why didn't you? Ryan thought about Emma, up early in the morning, eating cereal with mismatched socks. He thought about a water bill. He thought about how the world looked when you were trying to hold things together with both hands and someone was quietly cutting the floor out from under you. Because I've been on the wrong end of someone taking advantage of a situation, he said. I didn't like it. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly. She didn't seem like someone who did softness easily, but something that was the emotional equivalent of a door opening a crack. What would you do? She asked. Get a very good attorney, he said. Tonight, if possible. And don't talk to anyone else about this until you do. She nodded slowly. Can you fix it? She said. The car? I need to source an original spec engine. It'll take a few weeks to locate a period-correct unit that can be documented properly. But yes, I can fix it. She nodded again. Then she said, almost conversationally, Do you remember what I said when you arrived? He looked at her carefully. You said if I could fix it, you'd marry me. Your assistants laughed, he said. You didn't. No. She picked up her phone from the desk. Back to business. The door she'd opened a crack closed again, not in an unfriendly way, but in the way of someone who had a lot of things to do and had already categorized this one appropriately. I'll arrange access for whenever you need to work on the car, she said. Diane will get you a contact number for the garage. All right? Mr. Carter. He turned at the doorway. Thank you, she said. And for the first time since he'd arrived, she sounded like she meant something slightly more than the words. The drive back was slower than the drive out, not because of traffic, because Ryan was thinking. He thought about the car. He thought about Brower, who had died without knowing what had happened to HB041, or maybe knowing in the way that old men sometimes knew things without being told, by reading the shapes that trouble made in the air around it. He thought about the engine he'd need to source, the contacts he still had in Germany, the 3 or 4 collectors in the U.S. who might know of a period-correct unit available quietly. He thought about Isabella Kensington, standing in her half-office, half-library, holding her phone and looking like someone who had just realized the floor had been slightly wrong under their feet for a long time. He thought about Victor Langford, whose name he didn't know at all beyond what she'd said, but whose work he'd spent 7 hours documenting on his phone's camera with the methodical patience of someone who understood that evidence was worthless if it was incomplete. He pulled up to his house at 6:14. He knew, because he had 12 minutes before he needed to be at Emma's school for pickup, and he'd been checking the time the whole drive back. He sat in the truck in his own driveway for a moment. The house needed a new gutter on the east side. The front steps had a crack in the third one that kept getting worse. The maple tree in the yard was doing something unhealthy that he hadn't had time to properly investigate. None of it felt as heavy as it usually did. He'd fixed something today. Not the car. Not yet. But something. He'd looked at a situation that was designed to be invisible and he'd seen it. He'd told the truth when lying by omission would have been easier and more profitable in the short term. It wasn't a heroic thing. It was just the thing you did when you were the kind of person who did that kind of thing. He got out of the truck and drove to get his daughter. Emma was the last kid out of the after-school program, which was normal. She was always the last one out because she lingered, asking the teachers questions and helping stack chairs, because she was constitutionally incapable of disengaging from a situation without completing it fully. Ryan had no idea where she got that from. She climbed into the truck and immediately said, "You smell like grease." "I work on cars," he said. "You usually don't smell this much like grease." "Different car today." She considered this. "What kind?" "Old one. Fancy one." "How fancy?" "Rich person fancy." "Did the rich person watch you fix it?" "She did, a little. Couldn't fix it all the way today." "Need some parts." Emma absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment while they turned onto their street, and then she said, "Is it a good job?" "Could be," he said. "Good," she said, with the satisfied finality of someone who had asked a question and received an acceptable answer. She pulled a drawing out of her backpack, something she'd done in art class. By the look of it, a house with a very large yellow sun and what appeared to be either a dog or a very misshapen bear in the yard, and studied it critically. "I think the dog looks weird," she said. "It might be a bear," Ryan offered. "It's definitely a dog." She paused. "I'm going to fix the ears tomorrow." Ryan nodded. "Things worth fixing," he said, "are worth fixing right." Emma looked at him sideways with that 7-year-old radar for adult subtext. "Are you talking about the car or the dog?" "Maybe both." She seemed to accept this. She folded the drawing and put it back in her backpack. The truck rumbled on through the quiet residential streets, and Ryan Carter drove his daughter home, with a head full of engine numbers and chassis marks, and the particular weight of a secret that wasn't his to keep, and the knowledge that the next few weeks were going to be complicated in ways he hadn't fully signed up for when he'd answered an unknown number before 7 in the morning. But he'd answered it. That was the thing. He'd answered it, and now here he was. He put Emma to bed at 8:30 after a dinner of pasta with jarred sauce and a salad that she ate mostly around, extracting only the cucumbers with the precision of a surgeon. He cleaned up the kitchen, checked her homework folder, filled out the permission slip for the field trip, and found the $12 in a coffee can on top of the fridge where he kept miscellaneous cash. He sat at the kitchen table afterward with his laptop and a notepad. He had 3 contacts in the European collector car world who might be able to help him locate an original 2.7 RS engine. One was in Munich. One was in the south of France. One was in upstate New York, actually, a German émigré who'd been buying and selling air-cooled Porsches since before Ryan was born. He wrote emails to all 3. He kept them brief. He described what he needed without mentioning where or why. Then he opened his notes from the day and started organizing the photographs he'd taken. 37 photographs in total, tagged and time-stamped. The replacement engine and its identifying marks. The transmission. The 2 other components. The Brouwer provenance card. The hidden mark behind the engine case. He created a folder. He named it with a date and nothing else. He backed it up in 3 places. He didn't know exactly what he was preparing for. He was just being careful, the way Brouwer had taught him to be careful, not because trouble was certain, but because the cost of being unprepared for it was always higher than the cost of the preparation. He closed the laptop at 10:15. The house was quiet. Emma's nightlight made a small yellow stripe under her door. Outside, the neighborhood was the neutral sound of late evening. A car somewhere. Someone's air conditioning unit. Leaves. Ryan Carter sat in the kitchen for a while longer, drinking water this time, thinking about a white Porsche in a marble garage, and the woman who'd said something as a joke that he'd taken as seriously as anything. Not because he believed it, because he'd heard something in her voice when she said it, the kind of thing that people wrap in jokes because they don't know what else to do with it yet. He didn't know what any of it meant. He barely knew this woman. He knew a car she owned and a secret someone had hidden inside it, and that she had a business partner whose name fit the shape of the problem the way a key fits a lock. That was all. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. And the next morning, he woke up, made coffee, and waited to see whether the world was going to be the kind of world that let things be simple or the kind that didn't. He already knew the answer. He just wasn't in a hurry to get there. 3 days passed before Ryan heard anything from the Kensington estate. He went back to his regular work in the meantime. A transmission flush on a 10-year-old Civic, brake rotors on somebody's minivan, An oil leak on a Subaru that turned out to be two separate oil leaks pretending to be one. He talked to his customers with the normal rhythm of a man who did this every day, asked about their kids when he knew they had them, remembered that the woman with the Civic had mentioned her mother was in the hospital 2 months ago, and asked how she was doing. He kept his hands moving and his mind somewhere else entirely. The emails to Europe went out Sunday night. By Tuesday morning, he had 2 responses. Klaus in Munich said he'd heard of a 2.7 RS engine going through a private sale in Belgium, possibly correct spec, documentation unclear. He'd follow up. Henri in southern France said nothing like that had crossed his desk recently, but he'd put the word out quietly. The third contact, Walter Briggs in upstate New York, 73 years old and operating on what he claimed was 50 years of institutional memory about air-cooled Porsches, called instead of emailing, which was typical. "You looking for a motor or you looking for trouble?" Walter said, without preamble. "Engine," Ryan said. He was standing in the parking lot outside his shop, the phone pressed to his ear, watching a garbage truck navigate a 3-point turn that was going badly. "Because when a man your age calls me looking for a period-correct 2.7 RS unit and tells me nothing else, usually there's a story behind it. There's always a story behind it. This one feel different?" Ryan watched the garbage truck finally commit to its turn and grind away down the street. "It might be," he said. Walter was quiet for a moment. In the background, Ryan could hear what he recognized as the specific sound of a garage with a lift. Metal on concrete. Something compressed air-related. "I'll look around," Walter said finally. "You hear anything sketchy? You call me first." "Deal." He went back inside and torqued down the Subaru's valve cover and didn't think about the Porsche for the rest of the afternoon, or tried not to. The call from Diane came on Wednesday at 11:15. The shop was empty except for Ryan and his part-time helper, a 20-year-old named Marcus, who was currently using a wire brush on a set of rusty brake calipers and listening to something loud through his earbuds. "Ms. Kensington would like to speak with you," Diane said. "In person, if that's possible. Today." "Today's complicated," Ryan said. "She understands, but she'd like it to be today." He looked around the shop. There was nothing on the lift. Marcus was capable of handling the afternoon on his own. The field trip permission slip was filled out, the $12 tucked inside the envelope. Emma had a play date after school on Wednesdays with a girl named Priya, whose mother had Ryan's cell number. "What time?" he said. 2 o'clock? "I'll be there." He told Marcus he was heading out for the afternoon, wrote down 2 numbers for emergency contact, and left. He changed his shirt first, not into anything fancy, just a clean work shirt that wasn't stained, and drove back up through the city toward the hills. The iron gates opened before he even had to stop, which meant Diane had been watching for his truck. He drove down the sycamore-lined driveway and parked in the same spot as before. The house was quiet in the way that large houses are quiet. Not empty-feeling, but contained, self-sufficient. Diane met him at a side entrance rather than the main one, which he noticed. She led him through a different route than before. Not through the main hallway with the library, but through a service corridor and into a room that looked like it was used for actual private business. A rectangular table, 6 chairs, a credenza, a window that looked out on a courtyard garden that nobody seemed to be using. There was a pitcher of water and 2 glasses on the table, which he found oddly touching in its normalcy. Isabella was already there. She was standing when he came in, and she was not alone. There was a man in the room, late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of suit that cost real money without announcing itself. He had the compact, watchful stillness of someone who had sat in a lot of rooms like this one and knew how to make the air around him work for him. "Mr. Carter," Isabella said. She shook his hand again, Tate. Same grip, same brevity. "This is Marcus Ellery. He's an attorney. He's represented my family for about 12 years. Ellery extended his hand. "Ryan." He said the first name deliberately, the way certain attorneys did. "Building rapport, narrowing distance. Thank you for coming." They sat down. Ryan took the glass of water because his mouth was dry from the drive, and he didn't see any reason to pretend otherwise. "I want to start by saying," Isabella began, "that I spoke with Marcus the evening after you were here. I told him everything you told me." She paused. "I also had another conversation, One I probably should have had earlier but needed to think about first. With Langford, Ryan said. She didn't confirm it directly, but she didn't not confirm it. I asked certain questions, she said carefully, about the car, about the specialists, about timelines. A pause. The answers I got were not satisfying. Ellery leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, what you found in that vehicle, the documentation, the photographs you took, that material is important. We'd like to understand exactly what you can tell us about it. For the next 40 minutes, Ryan talked. He laid it out the way he'd laid it out for himself on his kitchen notepad, in sequence, without editorializing, sticking to what he could see and measure and document. He walked them through the engine discrepancy, the transmission casing, the two other components. He described the Brower mark and what it meant. He explained the provenance card and its significance, not just what it contained, but the context of who Brower was and why that documentation mattered. He pulled up his phone and went through the photographs one by one. Ellery took notes. Isabella watched the photographs with the still attention of someone who was absorbing everything and processing none of it visibly. When Ryan finished, there was a quiet that felt considered rather than empty. How difficult would it be, Ellery said, for someone to have arranged the component swap without being present personally? Could it have been done through, say, a third-party arrangement? Easy, Ryan said. You find a skilled enough technician, you give them specific instructions, you pay them not to ask questions. The work takes maybe 2 days if they know what they're doing, less if they have everything ready. He paused. But you'd need access to the car. And you'd need to know exactly what you were doing, not just mechanically. You'd need to know enough about how these cars are assessed and documented to know which components affected the valuation. That's a specialized knowledge set, Ellery said. Very. You'd need someone who understood both the mechanical side and the collector market side. Either one person who knew both or two people working together. Ellery wrote something down. And the Brower provenance card. Would the person who arranged the swap have known it was in the car? Ryan thought about that for a moment. That's interesting, he said. Brower didn't advertise the hidden documents. They were his private practice. The people who worked directly with him knew about them, but it wasn't widely known in the broader market. If someone commissioned the swap through a third-party tech, it's possible they didn't know about the card. Or, he stopped. Or, Isabella said, or they knew about it and couldn't access it without pulling the interior completely, which would have left visible evidence of disturbance. And leaving visible evidence wasn't the plan. The plan, he'd said it out loud without quite intending to. The plan, like it was a given that there had been one. The three of them sat with that for a moment. What I'm trying to understand, Isabella said, and her voice had gone very even, very measured, the way voices sometimes went when the emotions underneath them were moving fast and the speaker was controlling the surface, is the full scope of it, because this is one car. And Victor has managed my entire collection for 4 years, and my collection is... She stopped. Significant, Ellery said, the word doing a lot of work. 14 vehicles, Isabella said, ranging in value from about $80,000 to... She stopped again. The Porsche, at correct valuation, is among the less expensive ones. Ryan looked at her. There are 3 vehicles in the collection, she said, that I have never personally verified beyond the documentation Victor provided at purchase. I trusted the documentation because I trusted the source. The room went quiet again. Ryan understood then, not the full shape of it. He wasn't close to the full shape of it yet, but the outline. The outline was large enough to be serious. 14 cars, a 4-year relationship, a business partner who handled both the collection and, presumably, other aspects of a significant financial empire. One Porsche was either the whole thing or the visible edge of something much bigger, and everyone in this room was starting to sense which option was more likely. I need to say something clearly, Ryan said. He put his phone down on the table and looked at both of them. I'm a mechanic. What I found in the car, I'm confident about that. I can put my name on every photograph and explain every finding, but what happens next is entirely your territory, not mine. I'll cooperate with whatever you need from me, but I want to be clear that I'm a witness to a mechanical situation, not an investigator. Ellery nodded. Understood and appreciated. There is one other thing, Ryan said. He'd been deciding whether to say this since Monday morning and had kept going back and forth. The reason the car stopped running, the faulty engine, that's a known issue with a specific production window of the 2.7-liter 911 engine. If someone chose that particular unit deliberately, they did it knowing the timeline of failure. These engines typically begin showing problems between 18 and 30 months under regular use. But a car that's not driven regularly, maybe once a month if that, he paused. You could extend that window significantly. Isabella absorbed this. So someone installed an engine they expected to eventually fail, she said, but slowly, quietly, without drama. In a car that was already not being driven much, yes. So when it finally stopped working, it would read as an aging vehicle with a mechanical problem, not as sabotage. The word was out now. He hadn't meant to use it, but it was accurate, and accuracy mattered more than comfort in a room like this. Isabella stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard for a moment. Her arms were crossed, not defensively, but in the way people cross their arms when they were thinking and needed to contain themselves slightly. Victor found this car, she said, to the window. He identified it at auction. He told me it was a significant piece. He was the one who encouraged me to bid above my initial ceiling. She turned back. He told me it was worth it. Nobody said anything. He was right about that, she said, just not in the way I understood. She came back to the table and sat down. Whatever she'd worked through at the window, she'd worked through it. Her face was composed. Not closed, composed. There's a difference, and Ryan could see it. Marcus, she said to the attorney, what do we do? Ellery spoke for about 10 minutes, laying out what he believed the next step should be. A forensic accounting review, a quiet independent appraisal of the full collection, contact with a law enforcement consultant he trusted, and a period of deliberate normalcy during which nothing changed visibly and nobody was alerted that anything was happening. He was calm and precise about it, clearly someone who had navigated complicated situations before without panicking or overcorrecting. Ryan listened and said nothing. When Ellery finished, there was a pause during which Isabella looked at Ryan directly. You've been very quiet, she said. I told you what I know, he said. You and Marcus know the rest of it better than I do. Does any of this frighten you? The question surprised him. Not the content. He'd thought about the answer, but the directness of it. She had a way of asking things straight that felt like a choice rather than a habit. A little, he said honestly. But I've already taken the photographs. I've already told you what I found. That part is done. I can't unknow it. She nodded slowly. No, she said. You can't. He left the estate at 3:40. He had just enough time to get across town to pick up Emma, which he did with 4 minutes to spare, which meant she was still inside helping stack chairs. She came out to the truck smelling like craft glue and carrying a papier-mâché bowl that she had clearly made herself and was extremely proud of. What do you think? She asked, holding it up. The bowl was lumpy, enthusiastically painted in 3 different shades of blue and listed slightly to the left. It was perfect in the way that things made by 7-year-olds are perfect, not because of technique, but because of complete and total commitment. It's great, he said. What's it for? I don't know yet, Emma said. I made it first, and I'll figure out what it's for later. Ryan looked at his daughter. Sometimes he thought that was exactly the right order to do things. He drove her home and made dinner and listened to her tell him about a disagreement she'd had with a boy named Connor about whether sharks were actually dangerous or just misunderstood, a debate she had apparently won through what she described as a lot of facts. He asked where she'd gotten the facts. She said from a book she'd found in the school library. He asked if she'd returned the book. She hadn't. He added that to the mental list. He called Walter Briggs at 8:30 after Emma was in bed. I may have something, Walter said. There's a motor in the Netherlands, private collection, estate sale situation. The family's selling off the lot and they don't fully understand what they have. The engine number traces correctly. I can get documentation to you this week if the sale goes through. What's the asking price? Walter named a number. It was serious money. Not ruinous, but serious. Ryan ran the math. He could do it, barely, if the payment from the Kensington job was structured right. I haven't talked terms yet, Ryan said. Better do that. I know. Ryan. Walter's voice shifted slightly, lost a degree of the dealerly briskness. What's this job? Ryan considered the question. He considered how much Walter knew, how much he needed to know, and how much disclosure was appropriate from a man who'd been asked in a room to be a witness and not an investigator. It's complicated, he said. When you called me and asked for a period-correct unit with clean documentation and nothing else, I figured. A pause. Watch yourself. I will. And the kid? She's good. She made a bowl today. A bowl. In art class. Paper mache. Huh, Walter said, as if this was information he was genuinely processing. Kids or something? Yeah. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table with his notepad again. He wrote down the number Walter had given him. He wrote down the documentation timeline. He wrote down 3 questions about the Netherlands engine that he'd need answered before committing. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a house that cost more than he could conceptualize, Isabella Kensington was presumably sitting with her own version of this, except her version had 14 vehicles and 4 years of financial entanglement and a business partner who had been trusted completely and apparently shouldn't have been. He thought about what that felt like. Not the money part, the betrayal part, the specific quiet devastation of discovering that someone you'd built something with had been working against you the whole time, carefully, patiently, in the spaces you didn't think to look. He'd had his own version of that once. Nothing like this in scale, but the shape was the same. His wife's name was Carla. She had died 3 years ago, after a 14-month illness that had been brutal in the way that slow things are brutal. Not a shock, but an erosion. And in the last 4 months of her life, when the hospital bills were stacking and he was running the shop on fumes and barely sleeping, someone he'd considered a friend and business partner, a man named Dennis Fowler, who had been his co-signer on the shop lease and had helped him set up the business 5 years earlier, had quietly withdrawn $17,000 from their shared business account over a period of 6 weeks, transferring it in small increments designed not to trigger flags. Ryan had discovered it 3 weeks after Carla died. He'd been sitting at the same kitchen table, trying to make the finances hold together, and he'd found the discrepancies. Dennis, when confronted, had said he'd been planning to pay it back. He'd had his own problems, he said. He'd panicked. He hadn't thought Ryan would notice right away with everything else going on. Ryan had noticed. He'd gotten most of it back through a combination of legal threat and sheer relentless pressure, and he'd never spoken to Dennis again. The shop had survived. He had survived. Emma had been 4 and she hadn't known any of it, and he'd made sure she didn't know any of it, and that was the point. The point was you kept going. He stood up from the table, rinsed his glass, turned off the kitchen light. Emma's nightlight stripe was under her door. He stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the particular quiet of a house with a child in it, different from empty house quiet, warmer, more purposeful. He went to bed. He was starting to understand that whatever this situation with the Porsche and Isabella Kensington and Victor Langford was, it was not going to resolve quickly or simply. The forensic accounting that Ellery had mentioned, that could take weeks. The independent appraisals? Same. And in the meantime, he had a car to fix and a daughter to feed and a shop to run and a gutter on the east side of the house that wasn't going to repair itself. He was also starting to understand something else, something he was less comfortable examining directly. He'd been back to that estate twice now. And each time, when he drove through those iron gates and down the sycamore-lined driveway, he noticed himself noticing things. The way Isabella stood when she was listening, slightly forward, like she was leaning toward the information. The way she asked questions directly when most people in her position would have asked them through intermediaries. The way she'd stood at the window after saying Victor's name, just for a moment, working through something private before coming back to the table. He told himself it didn't mean anything. He was being professional. She was a client with a complicated problem. He was helping because it was the right thing to do, and because the car was interesting, and because he couldn't have looked at what he'd found and walked away. That was all. He turned over in the dark and stared at the ceiling. That was not all, and he knew it, and he chose to set it aside anyway, because he was 32 years old and a single father, and there was a cracked step on the front porch, and a gutter that needed fixing, and a kid in the next room who was going to wake up tomorrow and ask him something he wouldn't know the answer to, and he'd have to figure it out anyway, because that was the job. He closed his eyes. 400 miles away, in the Netherlands, an engine that had sat in a private collection for 11 years was part of an estate sale that a family didn't fully understand. The documentation was correct. The numbers traced. It had come from the same production run as the engine that had originally lived in HB041. It would take 3 weeks to clear the purchase and shipping. 3 weeks was a long time, given what was already in motion. But Ryan didn't know that yet. He was asleep. The engine arrived on a Thursday, packed in a wooden crate that had been built specifically for the trip and smelled of sawdust and industrial foam and something else. Old metal, preserved oil, the specific scent of machinery that has been kept properly and not used. Ryan signed for it in the shop parking lot at 7:40 in the morning while Marcus watched from the doorway with his coffee, not offering to help because he knew better than to touch something he hadn't been briefed on. Ryan cut the crate open himself. He was careful about it, which was not how he usually opened crates. Normally, he'd have the lid off in 30 seconds flat, but this was different. He worked the crowbar slowly, checking each nail before pulling it, because the kind of person who built a crate this carefully deserved to have it opened carefully. Inside, nested in foam cutouts that had been shaped to the engine's exact profile, was a 2.7-liter flat six that looked, to someone who knew what they were looking at, like exactly what it was supposed to be. Ryan crouched beside the crate and spent 5 minutes just looking at it before he touched it. He checked the case stampings against the numbers Walter had sent him. He checked the fan shroud, the magnesium castings, the oil filler housing. He checked 3 reference points that weren't in any catalog, things Brower had taught him to check because the catalogs didn't catch everything. "Well?" Marcus said from the doorway. "It's right," Ryan said. "Good right or just right?" Ryan looked up. "What's the difference?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "You looked like you were going to cry for a second there." "I wasn't going to cry." "Okay," Ryan stood up. "It's correct. Documentation checks. Engine number is consistent with the production period. Castings are unmolested." He looked back down at it. "This is what was supposed to be in that car. This is what should have been in that car for the last 40 years. Marcus, who understood very little about air-cooled Porsches, but knew when Ryan was talking about something important, nodded and went back inside. Ryan called Diane. He was at the estate by 9:30. The work of the actual restoration, the technical work, the thing he'd been trained for and was genuinely good at, took the better part of 2 weeks. Not because it was beyond his abilities, but because he refused to rush it. He worked at the garage most mornings, driving up after dropping Emma at school, working through lunch, leaving in time to get her in the afternoon. He brought his own tools. He refused the offer of Kensington's on-site maintenance staff, not out of pride, but because he needed to be the only person who touched this car, start to finish, so that he could say with complete certainty what had been done and by whom. The garage was his during those hours. Diane would appear occasionally to bring coffee he didn't always drink, and once Isabella herself came in and stood near the entrance watching him work for about 20 minutes without saying anything. He noticed her there but didn't stop what he was doing, and she seemed to prefer it that way. Eventually she left. He didn't know what she'd been thinking about standing there. He thought maybe she hadn't been thinking about the car. On the 9th day, he pulled the faulty engine completely. He documented its removal with photographs. Every stage, every connection point, every piece of disturbed gasket material. He labeled the removed components and stored them in a sealed container that he wrote his name and the date on, because Ellery had told him during a brief phone conversation that there was a reasonable chance those parts would be needed as physical evidence at some point. Ryan had simply said, "Fine," and handled them accordingly. On the 14th day, he started the engine for the first time. He didn't do it theatrically. He didn't invite anyone to watch. He just turned the key, alone in the garage with the doors open and the morning light coming in from the east, and the flat six caught on the second attempt, a ragged start, because it hadn't run in a long time, and there was oil to distribute and tolerances to settle. And then it smoothed out into that particular sound. The sound that a correctly assembled air-cooled Porsche engine makes when everything is right. A sound like something mechanical becoming musical without trying to. Ryan sat in the driver's seat and let it run. He wasn't sentimental about cars the way some people were. He'd worked on too many of them to maintain that kind of clean romantic feeling. He knew what they were: metal and rubber and controlled explosions, requiring constant maintenance, environmentally complicated, the source of about 40% of his daily stress in the form of other people's deferred problems. He knew all that, but he also knew what this particular engine sounded like from memory. He had helped assemble it at 24 in a workshop outside Stuttgart, with an old German perfectionist standing over his shoulder telling him he was doing it wrong until suddenly he wasn't. And hearing it now, in this garage, on this quiet Thursday morning, he felt something that wasn't sentiment exactly, but was adjacent to it, something that had to do with continuity, with things being put right. He sat with it for a while. Then he turned it off, got out, and called Diane to tell her the car was running. By that afternoon, Isabella was in the driver's seat. He stood to the side and watched her. She'd pulled her hair back. She was wearing driving gloves, thin, leather, clearly used before, which he hadn't expected, and which told him something about her relationship with cars that the garage full of classics had suggested but not confirmed. She sat in the seat the way people sit in cars they respect, not performing comfort, but actually reading it. She adjusted the mirror, which was slightly off. She put her hand on the shifter. "How's the clutch?" she said, not looking at him. "Adjusted. It'll feel light for the first few miles." She nodded. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the garage wall, and Ryan could see her running through something internally. Not mechanic stuff, not driving stuff. Something else. 40 years, she said. Roughly. Brower had it in 2009. Before that, it went through a few private owners in Europe. The card traces it back to the original Stuttgart delivery in '73. She was quiet for a moment. "And then someone bought it at auction and brought it here," she said. "And then someone made sure it would stop working." "Yes." She took a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. "Take me through it one more time," she said. "The whole mechanical picture. I want to hear it from the beginning." So he told her. He stood beside the driver's door of the car she was sitting in and walked her through the entire sequence. Not the investigation side of it, not Ellery's territory, but the mechanical truth of the car. What it had been when it came from Stuttgart. What Brower had done to it in 2009 and what condition he'd documented. What the component swap had changed, specifically, technically, in terms the car's history deserved. What the correct engine restored. What was still the car and what wasn't, and why the things that weren't didn't diminish the things that were. She listened without interrupting, which he'd noticed was a habit of hers. Some people listened by reacting. She listened by receiving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Ellery called me this morning," she said. "Yeah?" "The forensic accounting firm finished their preliminary pass." She paused. "It's not just the cars." Ryan had expected this, in the way you expect weather that's been coming for a while. "How bad?" "Preliminary estimate is between $4 and $6 million over 3 years," she said, "across multiple asset categories. The collection is part of it, but the bigger piece is in the company's financial structure." She said this evenly, clinically almost, the way you described a wound that was serious but had been cleaned and dressed and was not going to kill you. Phantom vendor payments. Management fee structures that were never properly authorized. Some creative reallocation of capital between holding entities, she paused. "Marcus says it's sophisticated." "Meaning it was planned." "Meaning it was planned from early on. He didn't walk into a situation and find an opportunity. He built the opportunity into the structure while the structure was being built." She looked out through the windshield. "He was in the room when those structures were designed." The garage was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something repetitive and slightly annoying in one of the sycamores. "How are you doing with it?" Ryan asked. He hadn't meant to ask that. It came out because she was sitting in a car that had just been put back together after being quietly taken apart by someone she'd trusted, and the parallel was too direct to ignore. She looked at him. "That's an interesting question from a mechanic." "You don't have to answer it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm angry," she said. "I've been angry since the Wednesday after you came here the first time. I've been doing a very professional job of managing the anger because there are things that need to be done, and falling apart in the middle of them doesn't help." She paused. "I'm also I feel stupid, which is worse than the angry, actually, because I'm not stupid, and this happened anyway. People who are good at this kind of thing count on the fact that smart people don't expect to be fooled, Ryan said. The smarter you are, the harder it is to believe someone's gotten past you. So you explain it away. You rationalize the things that don't add up. Is that experience talking? Some of it. He paused. Not the same scale, but the same feeling. She looked at him for a moment in that direct, measuring way she had, and he held it without flinching or looking away, because he'd said what he'd said and he meant it, and there was nothing to be defensive about. Victor called me Tuesday, she said. Ryan's attention sharpened slightly. About what? He said he'd heard I'd brought in an independent appraiser to look at the collection. He wanted to know why. She paused. I told him I was doing a routine insurance review. He said, and I'm giving you the exact words because Marcus told me to remember them. He said, I hope this isn't about the Porsche. I've been meaning to tell you about some concerns I had with the previous technicians. Meaning he was setting up a story, Ryan said, getting out ahead of it. Marcus thinks so. He's worried. He knows someone looked at the car and found something. Possibly, she said. Or he's being preemptively careful, which he might do regardless. She stopped. He's not a stupid man. That's the thing. He's intelligent, well-connected, and he has 17 years of professional reputation behind him. Whatever Marcus builds legally needs to be very solid, because Victor will come at it hard. She started the car again. Ryan stepped back slightly. She put it in first gear and moved it forward slowly, just to the edge of the garage, and held it there for a moment. Through the open garage doors, the driveway curved away between the sycamores in the morning light. She held the car at the threshold, engine turning, clutch in. She had an expression he couldn't fully read. Not reluctance, not hesitation. More like standing at a doorway, knowing that stepping through it was going to change something, and accepting that, but taking 1 second to acknowledge that the change was real. Then she let the clutch out slowly and drove it forward, out into the light, and let it roll to about 20 feet past the garage entrance, before stopping and sitting there with the engine running. Ryan walked out and stood beside her window. It's solid, she said. It should be. No creaks. No hesitation in the throttle. She looked at the steering wheel for a moment. You told me the first day that you knew this car from before. Yes. What was it like back then? He thought about 24 in Stuttgart and Brauer's workshop and the cold mornings in October when the light through the shop windows was sharp and low. He thought about being young enough to believe that working for the best restorer in Europe was a temporary stop on the way to something he hadn't figured out yet. He thought about the specific satisfaction of hearing this engine run for the first time after weeks of work. It was the first time I'd worked on something I knew mattered, he said, not just to the owner, but as an object, in the larger sense. And now? Now it matters again. She sat with that. Then she turned the car off, not because she wanted to stop, but because she had things to do and had given herself this one moment, and it was enough for now. She got out and handed him the keys, which was not something she needed to do. She was on her own property. But she handed them to him, and he took them. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. The parts you removed. The replacement engine, the transmission, the other components. Where are they? Sealed container in your garage with my name and the date on it. I documented the removal at every step. He paused. I told you I'd cooperate with whatever you need. Marcus is going to want to bring in a forensic vehicle examiner to independently verify your findings. Someone with court credentials. Good, Ryan said without hesitation. I'd want that too, if I were in your position. She looked at him. You're very comfortable with scrutiny. I do good work, he said simply. I don't mind someone checking it. Something passed across her face. Brief, complex. He thought it might have been the first version of something like trust, which was different from the professional reliance she'd been extending to him since the beginning. Trust was harder to give and harder to take back, and it had a different texture. He noticed it and didn't remark on it, which he thought was the right call. He drove home that afternoon feeling like something had shifted. Not dramatically. There was no dramatic shift to point to, no moment you could frame and label. Just the accumulation of 2 weeks of work, finished to a standard he was satisfied with, in a situation that had turned out to be significantly larger than a broken car. He picked Emma up. She had glitter on her face from some project that she described with great enthusiasm and insufficient clarity, something involving a rainforest diorama and a creative dispute over which animals were indigenous. She ate half her dinner, declared the broccoli acceptable but not necessary, and fell asleep on the couch watching a nature documentary about meerkats before he could get her to bed properly. He carried her to her room and set her down and pulled the blanket up and stood there for a moment in the dark. He thought about what Isabella had said. $4 to $6 million. 3 years. Built into the structure from the beginning. He thought about Victor Langford, a man he had never met, whose work he had spent weeks undoing and documenting. He tried to construct the man from what he knew: intelligent, patient, trusted, positioned carefully, playing a long game in a place he had helped build. The kind of person who made you feel like an ally while they were studying the architecture of your vulnerabilities. Ryan had met a smaller version of that person once. Dennis Fowler, who had shaken his hand at the shop opening and said he was proud to be part of it, and had meant it, or had meant something like it, the version of meaning that people who operated that way were capable of. Not no feeling, just feeling that didn't override the calculation. He wondered if Victor felt anything now that things were moving, whether men like that felt the closing in, or whether they had built enough confidence in their own intelligence to believe they could still manage it. He didn't have an answer. He just knew what his part of it looked like: a correctly documented mechanical record, a sealed container of evidence, 37 photographs, and a car that ran the way it was supposed to run. He went to the kitchen and called Ellery's office, leaving a message that the restoration was complete and the removed components were ready for independent examination whenever they needed them. He kept the message brief and factual. Then he sat at the table for a while and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he'd gotten fairly good at during the years when thinking too much about things had been a survival liability. His phone buzzed at 9:58. Not a call. A text, from a number he'd saved as the estate contact. It was from Isabella directly, not Diane. It said, "The car sounds like something. Thank you." He stared at it for a moment. There was something in the informality of it, the personal number, the hour, the way it was phrased, that had a different weight than the professional exchanges they'd been having. He typed back, "It's a good car. Glad it's right." He put the phone down. He picked it up again. He put it down. He was 32 years old and he worked on cars for a living, and there were at least 4 things wrong with his house, and a significant legal situation unfolding around him, and a daughter asleep down the hall who needed him to be clear-headed. He went to bed. What he didn't know, lying in the dark that Thursday night, was that the following morning was going to change the shape of everything. Not with a phone call or an email or a text, with a visit. Victor Langford came to Carter Automotive at 11:23 on a Friday morning, and he didn't come to have his car repaired. Ryan was under the hood of a Jeep Cherokee when Marcus appeared in the doorway of the shop bay and said, "There's a guy out front in a really nice car asking for you." Ryan straightened up. He wiped his hands on a rag. "What kind of guy?" "Expensive suit? 60-something. Looks like he owns things." Ryan set the rag down and walked out front. The car was an Aston Martin DB11 in dark green. Current model, flawless condition. The man leaning against it was tall and lean, with the silver hair that in certain circles signified not aging, but authority, as if the color had arrived not from time, but from a deliberate decision to project a particular kind of weight. He had an easy posture, relaxed shoulders, the kind of physical confidence that came from decades of rooms going quiet when you walked in. He looked at Ryan the way people look at things they've already categorized. "You're Carter," he said. "I am," Ryan said. "Victor Langford." He said it like he was used to the name doing something when he said it. "Do you have a minute?" Ryan looked at him. He thought about Ellery's voice on the phone, telling him the next steps. He thought about Diane's careful efficiency. He thought about Isabella at the window, working through something private before coming back to the table. "Sure," Ryan said. He didn't invite him inside. They stood in the parking lot in the thin October sunshine, the Aston Martin between them like a prop. "I understand you've been working on Isabella's collection," Victor said. His voice was measured, pleasant, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that the first 30 seconds of a conversation established the terms of everything that came after. "The Porsche," Ryan said. "Yeah." "How'd it go?" "Car's running," Victor nodded, like this was mildly interesting news. "Good. It's been a problem for a while." He paused. "I coordinated a lot of the specialist work on that car over the past couple of years. Frustrating situation. These old machines, they get complicated." "They do," Ryan said. Something happened in Victor's eyes, Jay. A very brief recalibration, barely visible. He'd been expecting either more resistance or more deference, Ryan thought, and was getting neither, and that didn't match whatever template he'd prepared. "I wanted to come by personally," Victor said, "because I think there may have been some miscommunication about the car's history, about what various specialists found." He paused. "Isabella mentioned you had some questions about the components." "I finished the job," Ryan said. "Car's done. You'd have to talk to Ms. Kensington about the rest." "Of course." Victor smiled. It was a skilled smile, warm, reassuring, the kind that had probably worked on a lot of people. "I'm not here to interfere with anything. I care about Isabella. I've known her for a long time. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to create problems that don't need to exist." Ryan looked at him steadily. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Victor tilted his head slightly. "Cars get complicated over 40 years. Parts get replaced. Documentation gets murky. Someone without the full history of a vehicle might draw the wrong conclusions from what they find." "Might," Ryan said. "I'm just saying, if you have questions about specific components, I'm happy to help provide context. I was involved in the original purchase. I know the provenance documentation in detail." He let that sit there. The offer of context. The gentle positioning of himself as someone helpful and cooperative. The implication, soft as smoke, that Ryan's findings might be incomplete or misinterpreted. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you coming by," he said. He said it like he meant it, which he didn't, but there was no point in saying anything else. "Like I said, the job's done. If you have questions about what I found, you'd want to talk to Ms. Kensington and her attorney." Something in Victor's posture changed. Not dramatically, not a break, nothing that obvious, just a slight settling, the way the air changes before weather. "Her attorney," he repeated. "That's right." Victor looked at him for a moment. Ryan looked back. The morning light was flat and neutral, and didn't flatter either of them. "You've been thorough," Victor said. It wasn't a compliment. "That's the job," Ryan said. There was a pause that had some weight to it. Victor's pleasant expression was still in place, but something behind it was working now, turning over quickly. Ryan could see it without being able to read it exactly, the way you could see water moving under ice without seeing what was moving it. "You have a daughter," Victor said. Ryan went very still. It was said casually, conversationally, the way you might mention the weather or confirm an address, just a fact offered into the air between them. "You have a daughter." As if he'd looked something up and found it useful. Ryan's stillness lasted about 3 seconds. "I'm going to need you to leave," he said. His voice was level. He wasn't shaking, which surprised him slightly. He felt very clear, the way you feel in cold air, everything sharp-edged and present. Victor's expression didn't change. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I didn't mean anything by it. When we talk about people making decisions that affect their situations, it's good to have the full picture." "There's no full picture that needs to be discussed with you," Ryan said. "We're done talking. I need you to get in your car and leave my property." Victor looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, as if concluding a perfectly normal business conversation, and opened the Aston Martin's door. "It was good to meet you, Ryan," he said. Ryan said nothing. He watched the car pull out of the parking lot and turn onto the street and disappear. He stood in the lot for a while after that, in the flat October light, feeling his heartbeat doing something complicated. Marcus appeared in the doorway again. "Everything okay?" "Call Ellery," Ryan said, "right now." He went inside and picked up his phone and called the number himself. Ellery answered on the second ring. He just came to my shop, Ryan said. Victor Langford, and he mentioned my daughter. There was a silence on Ellery's end that had a quality to it. Not surprise, not exactly, but the gravity of a person absorbing information that changed the shape of a situation they'd already been treating seriously. Are you at the shop now? Ellery said. Yes. Stay there. Don't call Isabella directly. I'm going to make some calls and I'll get back to you within the hour. A pause. Are you okay? Ryan looked at the Jeep Cherokee he'd been working on before all this. The hood was still open. There was still a job to finish. I'm fine, he said. Just tell me what this means. It means, Ellery said, that he knows we know, and now we know that he knows. Ryan stood in his shop for a moment after the call ended. The place smelled the way it always smelled, oil and metal and the particular dust of an old building that had been a garage for 30 years. The lift was at working height. The radio in the back was playing something he wasn't listening to. He walked back to the Cherokee and put his hands on the fender and looked at the engine and breathed. Emma was at school. She was fine. She would be fine. But Victor Langford had set her name into the air between them, and that changed things, and Ryan knew it changed things, and the particular cold clarity he'd felt in the parking lot was still with him, and he understood now, in his body as much as his mind, that this was no longer just about a car. Ellery called back in 47 minutes. Ryan had finished the Jeep Cherokee in the meantime, not because he was calm, but because standing still felt worse than working. He torqued down what needed torquing, checked what needed checking, lowered the lift, and moved the car out front with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned to keep his hands useful when his head was elsewhere. Marcus had asked twice if he was all right, and received the same answer both times, which was, yeah, just thinking. And Marcus, who was 20 years old and not unperceptive, had left him alone. When Ellery called, Ryan walked out back behind the shop where there was a patch of cracked asphalt and a dumpster and nothing else, and stood in the thin afternoon light with the phone pressed to his ear. I spoke with Isabella, Ellery said, and I made a call to someone at the DA's Financial Crimes Unit who I've worked with before. Here's where we are. Ryan listened. What Ellery laid out over the next 8 minutes was careful, precise, and not reassuring in the way that Ryan had been hoping for, though it was reassuring in the way that accurate information usually was. At least you knew what you were dealing with. Victor Langford had, as of that morning, apparently contacted 2 of Isabella's secondary legal contacts, people below Ellery's level, part of the broader corporate structure, and suggested that there were questions about the independence of the forensic accounting team that had been brought in. He was, in other words, already working the edges, planting doubt, creating noise around the signal. He's not panicking, Ellery said. He's managing, which means he thinks he still has room to manage. The visit to my shop, Ryan said. That was part of managing. Yes, he wanted to assess how much you knew and whether you could be reasoned with. A pause. The comment about your daughter, that's a separate category. I've already documented it. If he makes any further contact with you, any further reference to Emma, that becomes a formal matter immediately. What does formally mean in that context? It means law enforcement involvement, and it means that his calculated, careful approach to all of this becomes significantly more complicated for him. The financial fraud is a serious charge. Witness intimidation on top of it, even implicit intimidation, which is what this was, changes the character of the case. Ellery paused. He may not have thought through that calculation fully, or he thought the risk was worth it. He looked like he thought the risk was worth it, Ryan said. What do you mean? He wasn't afraid. He was assessing. Ryan tried to find the right words. Like someone who's used to being the most informed person in a situation and was trying to figure out if that was still true. Ellery was quiet for a moment. That's useful, thank you. Another pause. Ryan, I want to be clear with you about something. You've handled this entire situation with a level of professionalism and judgment that made a difficult case significantly cleaner. What happened today at your shop does not change that. You don't need to do anything different. You continue your normal routine, you document any further contact from Langford, and you call me before you respond to anything. And Emma? Isabella has asked to address that directly with you. She'll call you tonight. She doesn't need to. She wants to, Ellery said. Let her. Ryan put the phone in his pocket and stood behind the dumpster for a minute, looking at nothing. The afternoon had gotten colder while he was on the call. He could see his breath. He went back inside. He thought, standing at the sink washing grease off his hands, about the particular arithmetic of being a single parent in a situation that had gotten complicated. Emma was 7. She went to school every day, came home, ate dinner, drew things, asked questions about animals, fell asleep watching nature documentaries. She didn't know about any of this. She didn't know about Victor Langford, or the Porsche, or the $4 to $6 million, or the sealed container in a billionaire's garage with Ryan's name written on it in marker. She knew her dad went to fix a fancy car, and that the fancy car's owner was a lady, because Emma had asked about the estate in that offhand way kids asked about things they'd picked up from adult half-conversations, and Ryan had told her that much. He dried his hands. He did not want to be the kind of father who brought danger home. He had made a deliberate, conscious effort for 3 years to be the kind of father who kept the difficult things on his side of the door so that what was on Emma's side was as clear and safe as he could make it. He was also aware that the most dangerous thing he could do right now was overreact in a way that changed his behavior visibly, because visible changes were information, and information was what Victor Langford was collecting. So he picked Emma up at the normal time. He fed her dinner, grilled cheese, tomato soup from a can, the kind of meal that required minimal cognitive investment to execute, and that she reliably ate all of. He helped her with the 20 minutes of reading homework that her teacher sent home 3 nights a week. He listened to her describe a falling out with Priya over something that had happened during jump rope that he couldn't fully parse but that clearly mattered. And he did not offer solutions because she didn't want solutions. She wanted to be heard, and at 7 she already knew the difference. He got her to bed at 8:30. Isabella called at 9. "I'm sorry about what happened today," she said, and she didn't mean the abstract situation. She meant specifically, directly, his daughter's name in the mouth of a man who had no business knowing it. "You don't need to apologize for him," Ryan said. "I know that. I'm apologizing for my part in putting you in the position where he could do that." A pause. "Victor has known about my life for 4 years. That includes the people who work for me and around me. When I authorized your work on the collection, he would have... He keeps track of everything and everyone connected to my assets. He found out I had a daughter," Ryan said. "That's not your fault." "Ryan," her voice had an edge to it. Not anger, precision. "I brought you into this. I let you stay in it when it became clear it was more than a car problem. That means the risk you're carrying is partly something I created." He didn't argue with that because it was accurate, and she knew it was accurate, and arguing would have been pointless. "What are you doing about it?" he asked. "I've already spoken with 2 people at the DA's office directly. Not through Marcus. Directly. Because Marcus was right that it needed to be documented formally, but I wanted it documented through a channel that Victor can't get to." A pause. "I have resources in situations like this. I'm using them. Is this the first time you've had a situation like this?" A beat of silence. "No," she said. "Not exactly, but the previous situations were external. Someone trying to get into something. This is different. This is someone who is already inside." He understood what she meant. External threats had the courtesy of being identifiable. This kind of thing, the rot that grew in a trusted place, was harder. It was harder to see and harder to recover from, and it left a different kind of mark. "Is there anything you need me to do differently?" he said. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said. "The forensic vehicle examiner is coming Monday. Your documentation was apparently very thorough. The accountants have been using your timeline of component replacement as a reference point for when certain financial movements started." She paused. "You're the anchor of the whole thing, technically speaking. The car is what everything else hangs off." He hadn't thought about that. He was quiet for a moment. "The journal," she said, and her tone changed slightly. "The provenance card from Brower's restoration. The accountants want to verify its authenticity as part of the chain of evidence. Is there anyone who could speak to Brower's documentation practices? Who knew his work?" Ryan thought. "There are 2 people I know of who worked with Brower in the later years of his facility. One is in Munich, I have contact information. The other retired to Portugal. I'd have to find a current address. He paused. And there's Walter Briggs. He dealt directly with Brower on 4 or 5 transactions. He'd know the documentation style. Would he be willing to provide a statement? I can ask him. Thank you. A pause that felt like it had something in it beyond the conversation's practical requirements. How is your daughter? The question surprised him, not because it was inappropriate, the opposite, actually. It surprised him because of when she asked it, placed at the end of the business and before the goodbye, with something careful in the phrasing. She's okay, he said. She doesn't know about any of this. That's good. She made a papier-mâché bowl. A small silence. What? A few weeks ago, in art class. She didn't know what she was going to put in it when she made it. He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. She said she'd figure that out later. He could hear something in the quiet that followed. Not amusement exactly, more like the particular quality of attention that opens up when someone says something unexpectedly real. I like that approach, Isabella said. Me too. Apparently. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. He sat with his phone for a moment after the call ended, in the quiet kitchen, with the nightlight stripe under Emma's door and the October dark outside the window. He called Walter the next morning. Walter picked up on the first ring, which was unusual. I heard, Walter said. Heard what? That somebody came to your shop. One of the guys in Ellery's extended network reached out to me yesterday evening. Didn't give me details, just flagged that things were getting active. Ellery's network reached out to you? Ryan, I've known Marcus Ellery for 20 years. I sent you to him 3 years ago when you had the problem with your business partner. Why do you think I gave you his number? A pause. What do you need? Ryan explained about the Brower documentation, the provenance card, the statement request. Walter was quiet for a moment. Heinrich's methods were distinctive, he said. I can absolutely speak to that. I have records of 3 transactions where he provided documentation. I've kept everything. Another pause. Ryan, I need you to hear me on something. Okay. Langford's name came up in a conversation about 6 months ago. In a context that I didn't fully understand at the time, a dealer in Zurich mentioned him as someone who'd been inquiring about certain rare components, off-market, no documentation required. Walter's voice had gone to a lower register. I didn't connect it to anything then. I'm connecting it now. Off-market components, Ryan repeated. Parts that could be used to replace originals in documented cars. The kind of swap you described. Walter paused. He wasn't buying for one car, Ryan, or if he was, the person he was buying from thought he might be back. Ryan stood at his kitchen counter with his coffee going cold for the second time in recent memory. How many cars are in Isabella Kensington's collection? Walter asked. 14. How many did you personally inspect beyond the Porsche? Ryan hadn't. He'd been brought in for the Porsche specifically. None of the others. Then, Walter said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words like a man stepping in unfamiliar water, the forensic accounting finding of 4 to 6 million might be a floor, not a ceiling. The morning light through the kitchen window was doing nothing to make this feel better. Ryan put his coffee down. I'll call Ellery, he said. Do that. And Ryan, be careful. Not just about Langford making contact again, just in general. Men who've built something over 4 years don't accept its dismantling quietly. He called Ellery. He relayed what Walter had told him about the Zurich dealer and the off-market components. He heard Ellery's pen moving on paper on the other end of the call and the particular silence of someone whose understanding of a situation was expanding in a direction they'd half anticipated. How many of the collection vehicles have had specialist work done in the last 3 years? Ellery asked. I don't know the full list. You'd have to ask Diane. She'd have records of any access to the garage. I'll do that today. A pause. This changes the scope of the independent appraisal. I'm going to expand it to the full collection, not just the vehicles we flagged initially. Another pause. Does Isabella know about the Zurich connection? Not yet. Let me handle that. I don't want her responding to Langford before she's had time to process this addition. A beat. You're sure about the source? Walter Briggs is reliable? He's the most reliable person I know in this world, Ryan said. All right. He went to work. He opened the shop at 8, took in a Volkswagen with a coolant problem and a Toyota with a noise in the rear suspension that turned out to be a worn bushing. He talked to his customers. He made change. He ordered a part from a supplier and argued mildly about the delivery timeline. He was, to all outward appearance, a mechanic running a small shop on a Friday morning, which he was. He also spent a portion of the afternoon mentally constructing the full picture, laying it out the way he laid out a mechanical problem, what was known, what was suspected, what needed verification. The picture that was assembling itself was not comfortable. One car had been a specific operation, a single valuable asset quietly devalued. Its condition managed to prevent independent assessment. But if Walter Zurich information was accurate, that was a methodology, not a single event. And a methodology suggested a larger canvas. He thought about the 14 cars in that garage. He'd only been in the main bay. The Jaguar E-Type, British racing green that he'd noticed the first day. The Mercedes SL. The thing under the dust cover he'd never identified. The Range Rover that didn't belong. He thought about 4 years of access. He thought about the trust required to give someone that kind of access and what it cost to discover that trust had been used as a tool. The forensic vehicle examiner arrived Monday morning at the estate. His name was Carver. Just Carver, apparently, the way certain professionals who worked in specialist legal contexts went by a single name as if additional biographical detail might compromise their authority. He was in his mid-50s, compact, gray, with the unhurried manner of someone who had been hired by a lot of attorneys to look at a lot of things and explain what he found. Ryan had been asked to be present. He drove up after drop-off and found Carver already in the garage when he arrived, standing in front of the Porsche with his arms crossed, just looking at it the way Ryan himself had looked at the engine from the Netherlands when it arrived. "Carter," Carver said, extending his hand. "Carver," Ryan said. They shook. "I've reviewed your photographs and documentation," Carver said. "Your chain of custody on the removed components is thorough, better than I usually see from non-certified sources. Brower trained me to document everything." Carver looked at him. "You worked for Heinrich Brower." 8 months, 2014 to 2015. A small shift in Carver's expression, not warmth exactly, but something like a revised estimate. He was the best in the field. "I know." They spent 4 hours together in that garage. Carver was methodical and thorough and asked good questions, and Ryan answered them directly and accurately and did not editorialize. Carver examined every finding Ryan had documented and found nothing to dispute and 3 things to supplement. Additional observations that Ryan had noted but not fully developed, which Carver had the forensic vocabulary to articulate precisely in the terms a court would need. At one point, while they were both crouched near the rear suspension looking at something, Carver said, without looking up, "How'd you find the provenance card? It's well hidden." "I know where Brower hid them," Ryan said. "I helped design the hiding system." Carver looked up at that. "You designed it?" "Brower had the idea. I suggested the specific location. He liked the rear footwell channel because it was accessible but not obvious. You'd have to pull the carpet deliberately, but once you did, it was findable." He paused. "He told me once it was his insurance policy, that every car that left his shop properly should be able to prove what it was." Carver was quiet for a moment. "And this one proved exactly what it was," he said. "Eventually," Ryan said. Carver finished his examination in the early afternoon and spoke briefly with Ellery by phone from the driveway before leaving. Ryan was packing his own bag when Isabella came into the garage. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping enough. Not disheveled, she was too controlled for that, but there was a tightness around her eyes and a quality to her stillness that was different from the considered stillness he'd observed in her before. This was the stillness of someone holding something heavy. "Marcus told me about the collection," she said. "The other cars." So Ellery had told her. "I don't know how many are affected," Ryan said. "We don't know yet." 3 of the other vehicles have had work done in the last 18 months, she said. Specialist work, coordinated by Victor, at facilities I never visited personally. She said this last part with a self-directed edge that he recognized. The specific anger of someone who had given their trust intelligently and still been taken advantage of. That doesn't mean all three were compromised, Ryan said. No. She paused. But the independent appraiser Carver is recommending, his initial assessment of the Mercedes, just from the documentation review, suggests the reported valuation is significantly low. She stopped. He thinks the pattern is consistent. Ryan straightened up and looked at her. Marcus's new estimate, she said, pending full appraisal, is 8 to 11 million, not 4 to 6. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the numbers hadn't already said. She walked to the Porsche and put her hand on the roof of it. Flat palm, not a gesture, just contact. He'd seen people do that with cars they had feelings about, and it never looked the same twice. Do you know what the worst part is? She said. Not the money. The money is recoverable. The worst part is that I keep thinking about conversations, specific conversations, where I told him things about how I thought about the collection, what pieces mattered to me, why I acquired certain things. She was looking at her hand on the car's roof, and now I'm going back through every one of those conversations and wondering if he was listening to me or studying me. Ryan understood that feeling, not in the same way. His version had been smaller, more immediate, less architecturally complex, but the specific disorientation of rereading the past through a different lens, the way a decoded cipher revealed that what you'd taken for warmth was actually just strategic patience. He understood that. People who do what he did, Ryan said, they're good at making you feel known. That's the operational skill. It's not the fraud. Anyone with access and intelligence can move money. The skill is making the trust feel real. She looked at him. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, he said honestly. I don't think anything does right now. I think you just have to wait until it does. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't entirely humorless either. That's not very reassuring. You asked me before if any of this frightened me, he said. You said you appreciated that I was honest. I did, she said. Then, honestly, I don't have a reassuring version of this part. The part where you have to sit with what someone did. It takes as long as it takes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took her hand off the roof of the car and straightened up. The vehicle examiner's report will be filed with the DA's office this week, she said, back in the practical register. Combined with the accounting findings and Walter Briggs's statement about the Brower documentation, Marcus says the evidentiary foundation is solid. Good. Victor doesn't know how solid. A pause. He reached out to me this morning. He wants a meeting. He said he thinks there's been a misunderstanding he'd like to clear up. What did you say? I said I'd have Marcus respond. Her mouth pressed together slightly. He pushed back, said it should be a personal conversation between him and me the way things always were. She stopped. The way things always were. That's what he said. Ryan looked at her. Don't meet with him alone. I know that. Not because you can't handle him, he said, because anything said in an undocumented private meeting becomes, he said, she said. I know, she said again. And then, with a precision that told him she'd already thought this through, he's trying to get me in a room where I'm making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. He's counting on 17 years of professional relationship to create enough noise that I hesitate. Will it work? She looked at him. Her jaw was set. No. He believed her. He left the estate at 2:15. He had 20 minutes before Emma's pickup, enough time if he didn't hit the lights badly. He drove down the Sycamore driveway and through the iron gates and out into normal city traffic, and he felt the shift that always happened. The transition between the world of the estate and the world where he actually lived, which were separated by more than geography. He thought about what Walter had said. 8 to 11 million if the expanded appraisal held. 4 years of systematic work, built into the structure from the beginning. Victor Langford, who was currently trying to arrange private meetings while simultaneously knowing that law enforcement was now formally involved. Who had stood in Ryan's parking lot and mentioned Emma the way you mention a playing card you haven't played yet. Ryan thought about that specifically. He'd been thinking about it since Friday. Not with fear. The fear had been the first 3 seconds, that cold clarity in the parking lot. What replaced it was something colder and more deliberate. Victor had shown him a card, had meant it as a warning, had meant Ryan to feel the weight of it and adjust his behavior accordingly. Ryan had adjusted his behavior, just not in the direction Victor intended. He'd called Ellery. He'd called Walter. He'd been more thorough with his documentation, not less. He'd shown up Monday morning and spent 4 hours with Carver giving him everything he had. He was not a man who responded to pressure by making things smaller and quieter. He'd learned that about himself at 30, when the world had given him every reason to pull back, and he'd discovered that pulling back felt worse than holding the line. He pulled up to the school with 4 minutes to spare. Emma came out with Priya, which meant the jump rope incident had resolved itself, which was a relief. She was carrying a library book, a different one, he noticed, and her hair was doing something marginally better than usual, which meant she'd asked someone at school to help her fix it, a development that he found both touching and slightly melancholy. She climbed in. She smelled like the cafeteria and something vaguely crayon-adjacent. "Good day?" he said. "Medium," she said, with the honesty of someone who had not yet learned to default to fine. "Math was hard. Lunch was okay. Priya and I are friends again." "What happened with the math?" "Fractions," she said, with the tone of someone describing a natural disaster. "We can work on it tonight." She considered this. "After dinner, though." "After dinner." She opened the library book and began reading, which meant she was done with conversation for now, which he respected. He drove through the afternoon traffic with his daughter reading beside him and the ordinary city going past the windows, and he thought about fractions and the cracked third step on the porch and the east gutter and the water bill. And he thought about an engine sitting in a garage on the other side of the city that was finally running the way it was supposed to. And he thought about a man with silver hair who had placed his daughter's existence into a conversation like a token on a board. He thought, "You should not have done that. Not as a threat, not even as anger exactly, just as a fact." A man who spent 4 years building something patient and sophisticated and nearly invisible had, in the parking lot of a small auto repair shop, made one unpatient, unsophisticated, entirely visible mistake. And Ryan Carter, who was a mechanic and a single father and not an investigator, who had answered an unknown number before 7 in the morning on a day when he was worried about a water bill, had been standing there to see it. The light changed. He drove. The fractions took 40 minutes. Ryan sat at the kitchen table with Emma and a sheet of scratch paper, and they worked through it the way he worked through mechanical problems. Slowly, from the beginning, not skipping steps because the steps were the point. Emma was frustrated in the specific way of someone who was intelligent enough to know she didn't understand something and impatient enough to find that intolerable. She erased hard enough to tear the paper twice. She said fractions were stupid, which Ryan did not argue with because sometimes things were stupid and still had to be learned. By the end of it, she understood the core of it. Not fluently. Fluency would take more practice, but she understood the logic. And understanding the logic was the part that mattered because everything else was just repetition. She went to bed satisfied, which was what he'd been working toward. He sat at the kitchen table afterward, in the quiet, and thought about the fact that tomorrow the DA's Financial Crimes Unit was meeting with Ellery and a representative from the forensic accounting firm to review the full evidentiary package. It had taken 6 weeks to assemble. 6 weeks from the moment Carver filed his vehicle examination report to the point where everything, the mechanical findings, the accounting trail, Walter Briggs's written statement about Brower's documentation practices, the Zurich dealer contact that Walter had eventually named formally, had been organized into something that could be presented as a coherent picture. 6 weeks was not a long time in the context of a case this complex. Ellery had said so. The DA's office had moved faster than expected, which meant the evidence was what it appeared to be, which was solid, layered, and difficult to argue with. Victor Langford had hired a very good attorney. Ryan knew this because Ellery had mentioned the name in a tone that conveyed professional acknowledgement without alarm. The attorney had attempted, in the first 2 weeks after the formal investigation opened, to position the financial discrepancies as accounting irregularities. Misallocation, improper authorization, things that were errors of judgment rather than deliberate fraud. The attorney was skilled, The argument was constructed carefully. It did not hold because the vehicle evidence did not allow it to hold. The cars were the problem for Victor, and would remain the problem. You could argue accounting interpretation. You could debate authorization structures and corporate governance and the reasonable latitude given to a trusted executive over 4 years. Lawyers were good at creating fog around those things, and Victor's attorney was better than most. But the cars were physical. They were objects. The components that had been swapped were in a sealed container with Ryan's name on it and Carver's independent verification attached to it. And Carver had 40 depositions worth of court credential behind his report. The Brower provenance card was authenticated. The Zurich dealer, when formally contacted, had confirmed the off-market component inquiries and provided transaction records that put specific parts in specific hands at specific times. The timeline that emerged from those records aligned, with a precision that the defense could not explain away, with the forensic accounting timeline. It was, as Ellery had said quietly to Ryan on the phone 3 weeks into the process, the kind of case that built itself once someone found the right door. Ryan had found the door. He hadn't been looking for it. That was the thing he kept coming back to, sitting in his kitchen in the November dark. He'd gone to fix a car. He'd recognized a mark that most people in the world wouldn't have recognized, because he'd spent 8 months in a workshop in Stuttgart with a man who believed that every car worth restoring was worth protecting permanently, and who had taught the 24-year-old version of Ryan Carter to hide that protection in a place only the right eyes would find it. Brower had been dead for 4 years. He'd died not knowing what had happened to HB041. But the work he'd done, the mark, the card, the philosophy of documentation that he'd instilled in the people who worked for him, had survived him and had done exactly what he'd built it to do. Ryan thought about that sometimes, about how the things you do with integrity accumulate in ways you can't predict and don't get to see. You build something careful and true, and then you're gone, and the careful, true thing keeps working in the world without you. He went to bed. The call from Ellery came at 11:43 the following evening. Ryan was still awake, barely, sitting in bed with a paperback he'd been trying to read for 3 weeks. He answered on the second ring. "It's done," Ellery said. Ryan put the book down. "Done how?" "Victor Langford was arrested this evening at his home. The DA moved tonight because there was intelligence suggesting he was preparing to transfer certain assets offshore. They didn't want to wait for the morning." A pause. "The charges are financial fraud, systematic asset manipulation, and witness intimidation. The last one was added specifically because of the incident at your shop." Ryan sat in the dark of his bedroom and absorbed this. "How is Isabella?" he asked. "She was informed an hour ago. She's composed. She said to tell you she'd call you tomorrow." Ellery paused. "Ryan, I want you to understand something clearly. The witness intimidation charge was not a minor addition. In this jurisdiction, with the specific language of what Langford said to you, see, the reference to your daughter in the context of an active investigation, that carries real weight. It changes the sentencing calculation significantly. His attorney is going to have a very hard time minimizing it." "Good," Ryan said, and meant it without heat. Not vindictively, just accurately. "The forensic accounting final estimate came in today as well," Ellery said. "Before the arrest, $9.4 million over 4 years, across 14 asset categories, including the vehicle collection. The vehicle portion alone accounts for approximately $2.8 million. $9.4 million. Ryan thought about that number for a moment. Not what it meant to him, but what it meant to a person who had spent 4 years standing next to someone she trusted, watching him manage her assets, asking his advice, building things with him. What it meant to discover the full scope of it in a number. "Will she get it back?" Ryan asked. "Most of it. The asset recovery process will take time, but the documentation trail is thorough enough that the legal mechanism for recovery is strong." A pause. "She's aware of that." After the call ended, Ryan sat in the dark for a while longer. Emma was asleep down the hall. The house was quiet in its usual way. The particular inhabited quiet that he had come to understand as a kind of presence rather than an absence. Outside, November was doing what November did, cold and unglamorous, the leaves gone from the maple in the yard, the gutters, including the east one he'd finally gotten fixed 3 weeks ago. Empty and dark. He thought about Dennis Fowler, briefly. $17,000 and a betrayal that had come during the worst 14 months of his life. He'd recovered from it. It had left a mark, but marks were not the same as damage, and he knew the difference. He thought about the way certain things were connected across time in ways you couldn't see from inside them. Brower teaching him to document. Walter Briggs sending him to Ellery. An unknown number before 7 in the morning that he'd almost not answered. He thought about a white Porsche in a marble garage, and the specific sound it made now when the engine turned over. He turned off the light. Isabella called the next morning at 9, after Emma was at school. "You heard," she said. "Ellery called last night." "I wanted to call you myself, but I needed—" She stopped. "I needed a few hours." "I understand." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not broken, nothing like that, but the controlled surface was thinner than usual, something real moving close to it. $9.4 million, she said. "I keep saying the number trying to make it feel real. It still doesn't entirely." "It might take a while," Ryan said. "Marcus says 12 to 18 months for full recovery, pending litigation." A pause. "Victor's attorney has already signaled they'll fight it." "Of course they will. Of course." She said it with a flat exhaustion that was more honest than anger. "Ryan, I want to tell you something directly. The case exists the way it does because of what you found and how you documented it. The vehicle evidence is the structural foundation of everything. Without it, the accounting findings are significant but arguable. With it," she stopped. "Victor's attorney apparently described your documentation as, quote, inconveniently thorough." Ryan almost smiled. "Good." "It is good." A pause. "I want to compensate you properly for everything. Not just the restoration fee, which I realize we've never formally settled, which is my oversight, but for the full scope of what you did." "The restoration fee is enough," he said. "Ryan, I'm serious. I did the job I was hired to do. The rest of it—" He paused, thinking about how to say it accurately. "I didn't do it for compensation. I did it because I couldn't not do it." She was quiet for a moment. He could sense her deciding whether to push back on this, and deciding not to. "Then let me do something else," she said. "There's something I want to give you, not payment, something else. Can you come to the estate this weekend? Bring Emma, if you want." He hadn't been expecting that. "You don't need to—" "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to. There's something here that belongs with you more than it belongs with me. I realized that a few weeks ago, and I've been waiting for the right moment." He said yes. Saturday was gray and cold, the kind of November day that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just threatened to. Emma wore her good coat without being told, which meant she understood this was a different kind of outing, and she was quiet in the truck on the way over in the way she was quiet when she was processing the significance of something. "Is this the lady with the fancy car?" she said as they turned through the iron gates. "Yes." "The one you fixed?" "That's the one." Emma looked out the window at the sycamores. The leaves were all gone now, the branches clean and bare against the gray sky. "Is she nice?" Emma asked. Ryan thought about this honestly, the way he tried to think about things when Emma asked him directly. "Yes," he said. "She's had a hard few months, but she's a good person." Emma accepted this. She looked at the house as they pulled up, with the frank assessment of a 7-year-old cataloging new information. "It's very big," she said. "It is." "Do you get lost?" "A little, the first time." Diane met them at the door, which was the main door this time, rather than the service entrance. She greeted Ryan and shook Emma's hand with a seriousness that Emma clearly appreciated. She led them through the house, not the library office route, not the service corridor, but through the main rooms, which Ryan hadn't been through before. They were large and well-furnished and slightly less intimidating than he'd imagined, partly because they had the lived-in quality of rooms that were actually used rather than displayed. Isabella was in the garage. She was standing beside the Porsche when they came in, and she was wearing almost exactly what she'd been wearing the first day Ryan had arrived. Dark trousers, white button-down, sleeves rolled up. And he wondered if that was intentional or just how she dressed on weekends, and suspected it was the latter. She looked different, though, not physically, just lighter. Not happy exactly. Not yet, because $9.4 million and a betrayal of that depth didn't resolve into lightness quickly. But the specific heaviness he'd been watching her carry for 2 months had shifted. She was standing straighter. She looked at Emma with a warmth that Ryan hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure how to categorize. "You must be Emma," she said. "Yes," Emma said. She looked at the Porsche. "Is that the car?" "That's it." Emma walked toward it with the careful respect of someone who had heard enough about the car to understand it mattered. She looked at it without touching it, which Ryan had not told her to do, which meant she was operating on instinct, and it was the right instinct. She walked around the back and looked at the spoiler and the rear fenders. She looked at the wheels. "It's pretty," she said finally. "It is," Isabella said. "Dad said it was broken for a long time. Almost 2 years." Emma considered this. "And now it's fixed." "Now it's fixed." Emma looked at Ryan with the particular expression she wore when she was connecting dots. He looked back at her blandly. She turned back to the car. Isabella looked at Ryan. He looked at her. Something passed between them that had no precise name, an acknowledgement, maybe, of the strange and improbable path that had led to this particular Saturday morning in this particular garage. "There's something I want to show you," Isabella said to Ryan. She moved to the far end of the garage where the car under the dust cover had been the whole time he'd been coming here. She pulled the cover off. Underneath was a desk. Not literally. What was underneath was a low wooden chest, old, with brass fittings, the kind that might hold documents or tools or the accumulated material of a working life. On top of it was a leather-bound journal, large format, its cover worn to a softness that spoke of years of handling. After the Brower documentation was authenticated, Isabella said, Marcus had his contacts make some inquiries in Germany, into Brower's estate. She paused. Heinrich Brower kept a working journal his entire career, from his first restoration in 1981 to his last completed project in 2018. Everything he worked on, every technique, every apprentice. She looked at Ryan. His estate donated the journals to an archive in Stuttgart after he died, but his daughter kept the volume that covered 2014 and 2015. Ryan looked at the journal. She was contacted about the case, Isabella said, about the provenance card, and what it documented, how it became relevant, and she sent this. She said her father would have wanted the person who designed the hiding system to have the year that contained it. Ryan crossed the garage and picked up the journal. It was heavy, in the way that things are heavy when they contain actual substance rather than just mass. He opened it carefully. Brower's handwriting was in German, small and precise, the same handwriting Ryan remembered from the workshop. On parts tags, on specification sheets, on the notes he'd leave on the workbench when he wanted to tell an apprentice something without making a production of it. Ryan's German was rusty enough to need work, but he could read the dates and the car references and the progression of projects. He found HB-041 about a third of the way through. 3 pages. Brower had drawn diagrams when he needed to, small, exact, annotated. He'd written the findings, the decisions, the timeline. He'd written in a separate section notes on the apprentices involved with each project, which Ryan hadn't known he did, and which made his chest do something uncomfortable. The entry about Ryan was 6 lines. He read it slowly, working through the German, and when he'd finished, he stood there for a moment with the journal open in his hands. "What does it say?" Emma said. She had appeared at his elbow without him noticing. He cleared his throat. "It says, roughly, that the apprentice from America had good instincts and poor patience and learned to slow down, and that he had a mechanic's hands but a restorer's eye, which was the rarer of the two." Emma read his face. "Is that good?" "Yeah," Ryan said. "That's good." He closed the journal carefully. He stood there with it for a moment, and the garage was quiet around him. The cars in their bays, the November light coming through the high windows, Brower's handwriting under his hands, the flat 6 engine in the white Porsche waiting in the center bay exactly the way it was supposed to wait, exactly as it had been intended to wait 40 years ago when it rolled out of Stuttgart. "Thank you," he said to Isabella. He meant it in ways he didn't have more specific words for. She nodded once. She understood what he meant. They stayed for 2 hours. Diane made coffee, and Emma was given hot chocolate that she declared excellent, and she sat on a stool near the Porsche and continued her assessment of the car with the systematic attention of someone who had decided it was interesting. Isabella showed her the Fuchs wheels and explained with surprising patience why the design was significant. Emma asked why they were called Fuchs. Isabella said it was the designer's name. Emma thought about this and said it was funny to name a wheel after yourself. And Isabella said, with the expression of someone discovering something, that she'd never thought about it that way before, but Emma was probably right. Ryan watched this exchange from a few feet away and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to add and he liked watching it happen. Before they left, Isabella walked them out to the truck. Emma ran ahead to check if the sycamores had any leaves left, which they didn't. Isabella stood beside Ryan at the truck, and they watched Emma for a moment. "The case will be in the courts for a while," Isabella said. "You'll be called to testify at some point, most likely, probably more than once." "I know, that's fine. I want to make sure you have everything you need when that happens. Ellery's office will prep you. It won't be difficult. It'll just be telling the truth." "That's the easiest part," Ryan said. She looked at him. "Is it really?" He thought about it. "When you know what you saw and you documented it properly," he said, "then, yeah. The truth is just the record. You just read the record." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you told me that day in the garage. About trust. About how the people who do what Victor did are good at making it feel real." She paused. "I've been thinking about whether that means I should be more careful in general, whether it's a lesson about my judgment." "I don't think that's the lesson," Ryan said. "What is?" He thought about it carefully, because she was asking sincerely and she deserved a sincere answer. "I think the lesson is that the problem isn't your ability to trust. The problem is that some people are genuinely skilled at exploiting it. Those aren't the same thing, and confusing them costs you something you don't want to lose." He paused. "Becoming someone who doesn't trust doesn't protect you. It just means the damage he did keeps going after he's gone." She looked at him for a long moment. The November cold was doing something to both of them, bringing color to her face, making the gray day feel more present. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've had reason to." She nodded slowly. Then she said, and her voice had the quality it had when she meant something more than the words, "I think the problem with my judgment was narrower than I've been telling myself. I trusted the wrong person. I didn't have a fundamentally compromised capacity for judgment." She paused. "You showed me that, actually, without meaning to." "How?" "Because I trusted you based on almost nothing," she said. "A cold call from someone my assistant found through a referral. A man in a stained work shirt who showed up and started asking strange questions. And it turned out to be correct." She looked at him directly. "The trust wasn't wrong. The previous application of it was." Ryan didn't say anything for a moment. Emma was coming back from the sycamores, having confirmed the absence of leaves and apparently decided to collect small pieces of bark instead, which she was carrying in her coat pocket. "I want to ask you something," Isabella said, and her voice shifted slightly. Still direct, still clear, but with something underneath it that was different, more unguarded. "And I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." "Okay, he said. "Is there a version of your life where you'd want to work on cars like the Porsche more regularly? Not your shop. I know your shop is yours, and I'm not suggesting you give it up. But alongside it, there are people in the collector car world who do exactly that. Specialist restoration consultants, independent technical advisors, people who know what you know." She paused. "I know people. I could make introductions." Ryan looked at her. "That's not compensation," she said, before he could respond. "I told you I wasn't going to push on that. This is different. I think you should be doing this work. I think it's where your ability belongs, and I think you've been not doing it for reasons that made sense at the time and maybe don't need to be permanent." He stood with that for a moment. He thought about being 24 in Stuttgart and what he'd thought his life was going to look like from there. He thought about Carla and the illness and the shop and Emma and the way the future had become something you managed rather than something you moved toward. He thought about how that had been necessary and right and the only correct choice, and how necessary and right didn't mean forever. Emma arrived and showed them the bark pieces, which she had decided she was going to use in a diorama of some kind, details TBD. What kind of diorama? Ryan asked. I don't know yet, she said. I'll figure it out when I have all the pieces. He looked at his daughter. She was wearing her good coat and she had bark in her pockets, and she had just had hot chocolate with a billionaire, and she was completely unbothered by any of this, because she was 7 and the world was still mostly straightforward, and he hoped it stayed that way for a good while longer. He looked at Isabella. I'd like that, he said. The introductions. She nodded. It was a small nod, contained, but something in it was satisfied in the way that things are satisfied when they're settling into the right shape. He put Emma in the truck and drove down the sycamore driveway and through the iron gates and out into the city. The months that followed were not simple. They rarely are, when something that was broken gets put back together. The putting together takes longer than the breaking, and it happens in increments that don't always feel like progress from the inside. The court process was exactly what Ellery had described: slow, methodical, occasionally frustrating. Ryan testified twice. Both times, he sat in the witness chair and said what he had seen and what he had documented and what it meant, in the same plain, accurate language he would have used to explain a mechanical finding to a customer. Both times, the defense attorney tried to introduce complexity and uncertainty into his account. Both times, the 37 photographs and Carver's independent verification report and the sealed container of components with Ryan's name on it made complexity and uncertainty very difficult to manufacture. Victor Langford's attorney was good. Victor himself, Ryan understood from Ellery's careful summaries, maintained his composure throughout the proceedings with the same patient management that had defined his 4 years of fraud: controlled, measured, performing the role of a man who had been misunderstood rather than exposed. He was, by all accounts, very convincing to people who hadn't seen the evidence. The jury saw the evidence. The verdict came on a Tuesday, 7 months after the arrest. Financial fraud on 4 counts, asset manipulation on 6 counts, witness intimidation. The sentencing came 6 weeks after that. Victor Langford was ordered to repay $9.4 million, with interest and legal costs that brought the number closer to 11, barred permanently from operating in any financial advisory or asset management capacity, and sentenced to 42 months in federal custody. His attorney filed an appeal that Ellery assessed as unlikely to succeed, given the evidentiary record. Ryan learned about the sentencing from Ellery, who called him within the hour. "It's done," Ellery said for the second time, in a tone that was almost but not quite the same as the first time he'd said it. This time it had a finality to it that the arrest hadn't quite carried. "Good," Ryan said. He was in the shop. The lift was up. He was in the middle of a timing belt replacement on a Hyundai. "Isabella wanted me to let you know before she called you herself," Ellery said. "She'll call tonight." "Okay." "Ryan," Ellery paused, "you probably don't hear this from attorneys often, but you did good work, not just the mechanical documentation, the judgment calls throughout, the way you handled Langford at your shop, all of it." Ryan looked up at the underside of the Hyundai for a moment. "I just told the truth," he said. "That's what I mean," Ellery said. Isabella called that evening after Emma was in bed. Her voice had the quality he'd been hearing in it since the arrest, slowly, unevenly recovering, not linear, some days clearer than others. This day it was clear. 42 months, she said. "I heard. And the repayment order, full amount plus. Good." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep waiting to feel something more definitive," she said, "like a door closing. But it doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" "Like something finally stopping that I'd gotten used to hearing." A pause. "You know how in a building there's an HVAC system and it runs all the time and you stop noticing it, and then it shuts off and the silence is almost louder than the noise was?" "Yeah," he said, "like that." He understood. The absence of a constant background pressure didn't feel like peace right away. It felt like its own kind of adjustment. Peace came later when you'd had time to stop listening for the thing that wasn't there anymore. "How are you?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Actually better, not managed better, which is new." A pause. "The collection appraisal finished last week. The 3 affected vehicles have been correctly documented. The repayment recovery process starts next month." She paused. "The Porsche, with Brower's provenance and the authenticated documentation, the insurance appraisal came in at $2.3 million. "That's right," Ryan said. "That's what it should be." "I drove it last weekend," she said. "Just on the estate, early in the morning before anyone was up. The roads up here are long enough to get through all the gears." A pause. "It drives exactly the way it sounds." He smiled. "It should." "Ryan," she said, and her tone shifted into the register he'd come to recognize as the one she used when she was about to say something she'd thought through carefully. "The introductions I offered. To the people in the collector car world. I want to follow through on that. I've already mentioned your name to 2 people who would be very interested in having a conversation." "You don't have to do that yet," he said. "Things are still settling." "They are," she said. "But some things shouldn't wait until everything is settled. Some things you pursue while the settling is happening." A pause. "You told me that the lesson wasn't to stop trusting. I think the corollary is that the things worth doing don't get easier to start the longer you wait." He sat with that. He thought about the east gutter, which was fixed, the cracked step, which he'd repaired himself on a Saturday in October, Emma sitting on the porch handing him tools with the precision of a surgical assistant, the maple tree, which had turned out to have a fungal issue that a local arborist had treated, and which was, apparently, going to be fine. He thought about Brower's journal, which sat on the shelf in his bedroom between 2 books, because he hadn't known where else to put something that felt that significant and had decided that close was better than stored. He thought about Emma, who had in fact built a diorama with the bark pieces, an elaborate and not entirely accurate recreation of a forest ecosystem that currently occupied the top of her dresser and was gradually acquiring additional elements every few weeks. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll take the introductions?" "Okay, I'll take the introductions." She made a sound that was brief and warm and satisfied. "I'll send you names this week." After the call, he sat at the kitchen table. The water bill was current, had been current for a few months now since the restoration fee had cleared, a number that Isabella had set unilaterally and that was more than fair and that Ryan had accepted without argument because he was capable of recognizing when something was right. The shop was steady. Marcus had taken on a small wage increase that Ryan had been meaning to give him for 6 months and had finally managed. The permission slip envelope was in his jacket pocket for tomorrow. He pulled out his notepad and wrote down a few things, names to look up, a question he wanted to ask one of the Munich contacts about a technique he'd been thinking about, a note to check on the timing of the collector car show that Walter had mentioned was happening in March. He looked at what he'd written. It looked like a list of things a man did when he was starting to move towards something instead of just managing where he already was. It was a small list. It was the right size for where he was. He closed the notepad. He went down the hall and stood for a moment at Emma's doorway in the dark. The nightlight was on. She was deeply asleep, one arm thrown over the side of the bed, with the abandon of someone who trusted the world enough to sleep in it without armor. She was growing up in a house with a fixed gutter and a treated maple tree, and a father who was slowly, unevenly, imperfectly finding his way back toward the version of himself that had existed before grief narrowed the aperture of what seemed possible. She didn't know any of that. She just knew he was there, and that dinner was on the table, and that fractions made more sense than they used to, and that somewhere on the other side of the city there was a white car with an interesting history that her dad had fixed, which she had personally inspected and declared pretty. That was enough for now. Ryan Carter stood in the hallway of his house, on a quiet Tuesday night, with Brower's journal on his bedroom shelf and a notepad of small intentions on the kitchen table, and he breathed. Not everything had worked out. It never did. His wife was still gone, and she always would be, and the shape of that was something he carried in the ordinary way of people who had learned that carrying it was different from being crushed by it. The world was still full of Victor Langfords, patient, constructed, positioned carefully in places that trusted them. The work he did was still underpaid and undervalued by the people who didn't know what they had until it stopped working. But a car that had been deliberately silenced was running again, in a garage on the other side of the city, exactly as it had been designed to run 50 years ago by people who built things to last. A man who had treated trust as a tool had discovered, the hard way, that thorough documentation was more durable than any amount of careful management. And a 32-year-old mechanic in a small shop who had answered an unknown number before 7 in the morning on a day when he was worried about a water bill had found, on the other side of it, a version of his future that he hadn't seen coming and wasn't sure how to hold yet but intended to hold carefully. The same way you held anything worth keeping, with both hands, with patience, with the willingness to slow down and measure it 17 times before declaring it right. He went to bed. Outside, the city made its usual sounds: traffic, distance, the ordinary music of a world that kept going regardless of what any individual life did or didn't do inside it. The maple tree in the yard stood in the dark, treated and recovering, already making the slow decisions that would become leaves in spring. Some things take the time they take. That's not a flaw. That's just how putting things right actually works.